The landscape stretched out in shades of mud and memory, a silent testament to the industrial scale of death that defined the Great War. For over 4 years, the conflict raged, claiming nearly 10 million lives. The arithmetic of atrocity is almost impossible to imagine. 6,700 souls lost every single day for more than 1,500 days. Yet war is never just a statistic. It is a collection of moments, individual days etched in blood and fire. Some dates echo through history. The first day of the Somme, the German spring offensive, Verdun. These battles shape our understanding of the war's carnage. But hidden deep in the archives, beyond the familiar stories, lies a different tale. A single 24-hour period of loss so profound it stands alone. This is the search for the deadliest day of the Great War. The truth is buried in faded casualty reports, in ledgers kept by exhausted staff officers. Each nation recorded its dead differently. Some records were lost to later bombs, others to revolution. German archives destroyed in 1945. Russian records scattered and incomplete. We cannot know the total for all armies on any single day, but we can identify the day one nation suffered its greatest sacrifice. And the answer will challenge everything we thought we knew. Consider July 1st, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme. For Britain, it was a catastrophe etched into a summer morning sky. A force of volunteers, the New Army, went over the top. They advanced at a walking pace, expecting German defenses to be shattered by a week-long artillery barrage. They were wrong. The shells had failed. German machine gunners emerged from deep bunkers and opened fire. The result? A slaughter unprecedented in British military history. By the day's end, 19,240 men were dead. 38,000 more were wounded. A national trauma that would shape Britain's memory for generations. But it was not the war's deadliest day for one nation. Germany's darkest day came later, March 21st, 1918, the first day of the Kaiser's Battle, the Great Spring Offensive, Germany's last gamble. Fresh troops from the Eastern Front surged forward, employing new stormtrooper tactics. They infiltrated, bypassed strongpoints, and pushed deep into British lines. The gains were impressive, but the cost unsustainable. On that single day, approximately 11,000 of Germany's best soldiers fell, men who could not be replaced. The offensive would stall, and with it, Germany's last hope. For other nations, the records are whispers from a graveyard. Italy's darkest day may have been at Caporetto, or during a horrific Gans attack at Monte San Michele. Austria-Hungary, likely in the frozen hell of the Carpathians, where entire regiments vanished. For Russia, the full scale of sacrifice on any single day may never be known. Historians once believed France's bloodiest day was August 22, 1914, during the Battle of the Frontiers. The French army, clad in blue coats and red trousers, marched into the deadly sweep of modern artillery, a collision of 19th century tactics with 20th century firepower. The traditional figure, 27,000 dead, a number that defied comprehension. Then came the digital revolution. For the centenary of the war, France digitized its records, the Mémoire des Hommes database, a virtual memorial to 1.4 million soldiers. Historians began analyzing each record, card by card, name by name. The new estimate for August 22, 1914 was revised downward, around 21,000, a terrible number, but not the deadliest. The search turned to 1915, the war's forgotten year on the Western Front. For France, it was the deadliest year of the conflict. The British army was still small. The weight of the Allied offensive rested on French shoulders. Artillery shells were scarce, tactics untested. General Joseph Joffre's solution? A war of attrition. He called it nibbling, a gentle word for a brutal strategy. The Great Nibble would come in autumn 1915, a massive two-pronged offensive designed to break the German lines. Main effort the chalky plains of Champagne. Secondary, the coal mining region of Artois. The objective, collapse the Noyon salient, restore mobility to a stagnant war. French High Command was confident. Troops were told their élan would be irresistible. The preliminary bombardment began on September 22nd. For 3 days, French guns thundered, a promise of destruction. On the morning of September 25th, the weather turned against them. Rain fell steadily over Artois. A cold dawn broke in Champagne. At the designated hour, whistles blew. 500,000 French soldiers climbed out of their trenches and stepped into history. In Champagne, the assault initially seemed promising. In some sectors, the bombardment had succeeded. French infantry poured into shattered German trenches. Sous-Lieutenant Jean Duclos recalled, "The heart tightens at the moment of leaving the trench. Voices shout forward, a burst of energy, and here I am running across the yellow grass, revolver in hand, bayonets shining around me, and we keep running." From the German side, Corporal Oswald Eichler remembered, "Men in blue helmets had reached the dugout, attacking with hand grenades. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the plan might succeed. But the breakthrough was local, and it would soon become a trap."
The reports of initial success created a dangerous illusion at French headquarters. Commanders, miles behind the lines, saw arrows advancing on their maps and believed the breakthrough was real. The order came down: commit the reserves, exploit the success. The second wave went in, then the third. But the reality on the ground was very different. The German second line had barely been touched by the bombardment. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Artillery batteries, pre-sighted on no man's land, began firing with deadly precision. The French reserves advanced straight into a killing zone. Communication had broken down. Frontline units could not report the truth, and the slaughter continued unabated. Meanwhile, in Artois, another tragedy unfolded. French troops advanced toward the formidable Vimy Ridge, rain pouring down. The British were attacking nearby at Loos, but it provided little distraction. The critical shortage of French artillery shells became painfully clear. Their bombardment had failed to cut the German wire. Men became entangled in deadly obstacles, perfect targets for German machine gunners who had survived the shelling. Second Lieutenant Robert de Soblier advanced over a field still littered with corpses from fighting months earlier. In spite of the bombardment, there is still wire, that deadly obstacle that cannot be crossed under fire. In front of me, a sergeant collapses, his hands clutching his stomach. I try to bandage him, but his intestines hang from 2 wounds. He convulses, rolls in the mud, his movements slow. He cries like a little child. The human cost was staggering. The French 2nd Zouaves Regiment lost 24 officers and 1,100 men, all to cross just 200 meters of ground. The 5th French Hussars received a mistaken report that German trenches had been cleared. They charged on horseback, a 19th century tactic meeting 20th century firepower. 140 horses died in minutes. The riders were cut down by interlocking machine gun fire. By afternoon, the truth began to dawn at command posts. There would be no breakthrough, not in Champagne, not in Artois, only death on an industrial scale. Joffre's strategy of nibbling had become a meat grinder, and French soldiers were the raw material. Sous-Lieutenant Duclos found himself trapped in a captured German position. Invisible enemy machine guns are waking up, and we are flooded with bullets. It's like being surrounded by a swarm of bees. I suddenly feel a violent blow to my face. A bullet has just taken off the tip of my nose. The day stretched into endless hours of combat. Unlike the sharp, shocking violence of the Somme first day, this was sustained slaughter. Fresh units replaced shattered ones. Attacks continued even as darkness fell. The cost mounted with each passing hour. The German defenders, though pressured, held their ground with remarkable resilience. They had learned from previous battles. Defense in depth meant losing forward positions did not mean losing the battle. French troops were funneled into killing zones where pre-registered artillery could do its work with deadly efficiency. As night finally fell on September 25, 1915, no one knew the true cost. Counting would take days, weeks. When the figures were compiled, they revealed a horror beyond anything yet seen in the war. The French army had suffered its greatest single-day loss, a record that would stand for the rest of the conflict. The battlefield was transformed into a charnel house. In the sectors where fighting had been fiercest, the ground was carpeted with French blue and German gray. Wounded men lay between the lines, cries for help going unanswered. Medical services were overwhelmed. The scale of casualties exceeded anything planners had anticipated. In the following days, the offensive continued, but with diminishing intensity and even less success. The element of surprise was gone. German reinforcements arrived. The front solidified. The great autumn offensive of 1915 had failed. The Noyon salient remained, and the war of movement remained a distant dream. The true cost was only beginning to emerge. Regiment after regiment reported catastrophic losses. Some units had virtually ceased to exist. Casualty reports and inventories slowly made their way up the chain of command. When the numbers were finally tabulated, they shocked even the most hardened commanders. Meanwhile, the French public knew little of the disaster. Censorship was strict. Newspapers spoke of progress, of partial successes. The full horror remained hidden for years. Mothers, wives, and children back home received telegrams stating their loved ones were missing or killed in action, with no context to understand the scale of the tragedy. What made September 25, 1915 different from other bloody days? It wasn't just the numbers, though they were terrible enough. It was the combination of factors: the massive scale of the offensive across two fronts, the prolonged duration of fighting, the successive waves of troops committed to hopeless situations, and the tragic gap between expectation and reality, which caused commanders to keep feeding men into the grinder long after any chance of success had vanished. This day represented the perfection of industrial slaughter that defined the First World War. Death, optimized, systematized, executed on a scale previously unimaginable. And it happened not in the famous battles we remember, but in engagements most people have never heard of. The Second Battle of Champagne and the Third Battle of Artois.
When the final calculations were complete, the numbers told a story almost too horrific to comprehend. September 25th, 1915, stood alone in its horror. According to the meticulous records now preserved in the Mémoire des Hommes database, approximately 23,000 French soldiers were killed on that single day. This number does not include those who died later from their wounds, nor the thousands more who were wounded or reported missing. To put it into perspective, this single day of loss dwarfed the British casualties on the first day of the Somme, and far exceeded Germany's worst day during the spring offensive. The scale of the tragedy becomes even clearer when we consider the context. The French army was fighting alone, as the dominant Allied power on the Western Front. They were attacking well-prepared German positions without adequate artillery support. They were using tactics that had not yet evolved to meet the brutal reality of modern warfare. The result was that when the final calculations were complete, the numbers told a story almost too horrific to comprehend. September 25th, 1915, stood alone in its horror. According to the meticulous records now preserved in the Mémoire des Hommes database, approximately 23,000 French soldiers were killed on that single day. This number does not include those who died later from their wounds, nor the thousands more who were wounded or reported missing. To put it into perspective, this single day of loss dwarfed the British casualties on the first day of the Somme, and far exceeded Germany's worst day during the spring offensive. The scale of the tragedy becomes even clearer when we consider the context. The French army was fighting alone, as the dominant Allied power on the Western Front.
They were attacking well-prepared German positions without adequate artillery support. They were using tactics that had not yet evolved to meet the brutal reality of modern warfare. The result was the deadliest day, not just for France, but for any single nation in the entire First World War. So why has this catastrophic day been largely forgotten? The reasons are many. Just months later, the Battle of Verdun would begin in 1916, capturing the world's attention. Verdun became the defining symbol of French sacrifice. The Somme offensive similarly dominated British memory and historical writing. The Champagne and Artois battles of 1915 were overshadowed. They were eclipsed by larger, longer, more dramatic engagements. There was also a deliberate element to this forgetting. The French government and the military establishment had little interest in publicizing a catastrophic failure. Unlike Verdun, which could be framed as heroic defense, or the Somme, which despite its losses achieved some territorial gains, the autumn 1915 offensives offered no consolation. They were unvarnished failures, costly attacks that gained almost no ground while bleeding the French army white. The memory was too painful, too embarrassing to examine closely, so it was quietly buried in the archives, waiting for the digital age to resurrect it. The soldiers who fell on September 25, 1915, became just numbers among the 1.4 million French dead. Their particular sacrifice was lost in the overwhelming totality of the war's carnage. Yet their story teaches us crucial lessons about how we remember war. History tends to commemorate what is dramatic, what is politically useful. The famous battles, the turning points, the victories. These are the stories that capture our imagination. The failed offensives, the useless sacrifices, the days of pure slaughter with no purpose. These are the stories we prefer to forget. But in forgetting them, we risk losing sight of the true nature of the First World War. This was not just a war of famous battles and heroic stands. It was a war of endless grinding attrition, of days like September 25, 1915, when thousands died for no gain, their deaths recorded, but their stories untold. The French soldiers who fell that day deserve to be remembered, not as statistics, but as men who made the ultimate sacrifice in a war that was still learning its own terrible nature. They died in a battle that offered no glory, no breakthrough, no strategic advantage. Theirs was the purest, most tragic form of sacrifice, given not in the heat of victory or the drama of defense, but in the grim, hopeless reality of industrialized warfare. When we look back on the Great War, we must look beyond the famous names and familiar narratives. We must remember that the true cost of war is often hidden in quiet pages of history, in forgotten battles, in unknown graves. The story of September 25, 1915, reminds us that sometimes the most important truths are found not in what we remember, but in what we have chosen to forget. The 23,000 French soldiers who died that day speak to us across a century. They remind us that behind every statistic lies a human story, behind every number a life cut short, behind the forgotten battles a sacrifice that deserves to be remembered. In the end, understanding the deadliest day of the Great War means understanding not just how men died, but why we must never forget the price they paid. Yet there is another lesson here about memory, commemoration, and history itself. We celebrate the victories, the iconic moments, the heroic narratives, but the true story of war is rarely tidy. The industrial scale of slaughter in the First World War defies simple narratives. It is chaotic, brutal, often senseless. It is the story of men walking into no man's land, advancing over barbed wire, under machine gun fire, knowing that death awaited them in numbers too great to imagine. It is the story of ordinary men, made extraordinary by courage, but overwhelmed by the machinery of modern warfare. We also learn about the danger of ignoring reality in favor of hope. French commanders believed the artillery had prepared the way. They believed in their strategy, yet reality on the ground told a different story. Soldiers were fed into traps, wave after wave, under rain, mud, and machine gun fire. The human suffering, the psychological trauma, the raw horror of September 25, 1915 cannot be captured fully in numbers alone. And yet numbers help. They reveal scale. They give us a measure of the unimaginable. 23,000 dead in a single day. Not heroes on a triumphant battlefield, not victors in a grand campaign. Simply men made to pay the terrible price of industrialized slaughter. Their story urges us to remember not only the victories and famous names, but the forgotten, the lost, the quiet victims of history. In remembering them, we honor the true nature of the Great War, its scale, its horror, and the humanity at stake. September 25, 1915 was more than a day of statistics. It was a day that should remind us of the fragility of life, the weight of command decisions, and the cost of forgetting. The soldiers of Champagne and Artois, their lives, their suffering, their sacrifice, speak to us still. They call for remembrance, not of glory, not of conquest, but of truth. For to understand the Great War, we must look beyond its stories of fame. We must remember September 25th, 1915, and honor those who died there, so that their lives are never lost to history.